What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
My parents didn't watch the live stream of my TED Talk. My mother said she forgot, and my father said he was working in the yard, like that somehow excused the fact that they missed the single most important moment of my professional life. A moment I had clawed my way toward with blood under my fingernails and years of silence screaming behind every sentence I rehearsed. So I ended my talk with this. To those who said I'd never make it, stay exactly where you are. And by midnight, my sister was crying in my DMs. You want to know the worst part? I didn't even feel bad. Not for a second. Because the truth is, they weren't just absent that day, they've been absent my entire damn life. Growing up in the Barrett house meant you played by invisible rules. Rules no one ever explained out loud, but you knew you'd broken them the minute you tried to be anything other than what they expected. My younger sister Jenna figured it out early. She played piano, joined science club, got straight A's, and smiled on cue like she was auditioning for the cover of a college brochure. My parents adored her. They bragged about her endlessly, framed her certificates, and lit up when she walked in a room like she was the second coming of some suburban Jesus in a sweater vest. And me? I liked stories. I liked writing in spiral notebooks and pretending I had an audience when I spoke out loud in my room. I liked pretending I was somewhere else. That alone was enough to make me too much for them, too sensitive, too dramatic, too hard to manage. Every time I tried to show them a story I'd written or a video I made in school, they'd respond with some variation of "that's cute" or "what are you really going to do with your life?" I left home at 19, not because I had some grand plan, but because I could feel my spirit dying every time I sat through another dinner where the conversation revolved around Jenna's SAT scores and my mom's garden. I worked nights and studied during the day, switching majors 3 times and sleeping on couches. And yet, even in all that mess, I held on to something they never saw in me. I believed I could become someone. Not for money, not for fame, just to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy for wanting more. I didn't need them to believe in me back then. I just needed them to care. Even a little. But they never called. They never visited. They sent birthday cards with checks inside and no handwritten message. Like money could substitute for love, like a $50 check could undo a decade of being treated like an afterthought. When I finally got that email from Ted, the official invitation to speak on a stage I dreamed about for years, I cried in my car for 10 straight minutes. Not from joy, but from exhaustion, from every part of me that had kept going despite having no one in my corner. And even then, even after all that, the first person I called was my mom. Not my agent. Not my best friend. Not my mentor. My mom. Because even after everything, some wounded child inside me still wanted her to say, "I'm proud of you." She didn't. She said, "Is that the red logo one?" And then she asked if Jenna could come watch. I should have expected it. Really, I should have. But a part of me kept thinking maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That maybe the years and distance and accomplishments would have softened something in them. That maybe they'd sit down at a computer, click a link, and watch their oldest daughter do the one thing she was born to do. But the morning of the talk, all I got was a 3-word text from my dad. "Good luck today." No link request. No mention of watching. My mom didn't text until hours later, and even then it was a vague, "hope it went well." Like I'd just gone in for a teeth cleaning. And look, I know it sounds petty. I know some people don't have parents at all, and I should be grateful they're alive. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who know your name and still don't see you. I wasn't asking them to move mountains. I was asking them to open a laptop. The night before the talk, I barely slept. I kept imagining them sitting together on the couch, watching with pride, maybe even texting Jenna to say, "Can you believe that's your sister?" I imagined them clapping at the screen, even if I knew they wouldn't. And when I stepped on that stage, when the red circle burned beneath my feet and the audience leaned in to hear my story, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in decades. Because for once, I wasn't performing for anyone's approval. I was finally telling the story I had buried for years, the story they refused to listen to. And the story didn't need them anymore. I thought about Jenna while I was up there, too. She wasn't the villain in all this, not really. She was just the golden child who learned how to survive in a family where love came in the form of polite disappointment. We both played our parts. She leaned in. I ran away. I sometimes wonder if we both ended up broken, just in different ways. After the applause faded and the stage lights dimmed, I sat in the green room staring at my phone. Dozens of texts. Dozens of mentions. Old friends. Former professors. People I barely knew. Every single one of them had tuned in, even if only for a few minutes. But nothing from my parents. Not a single ping. That was the moment I knew deep down they weren't going to say anything. Not because they forgot. Not because they were busy. But because some part of them still didn't believe I deserved that stage. I was still their overly emotional daughter with her little stories and artsy phases. I wasn't Jenna. I wasn't the one they chose. And that's when I realized I didn't need them to choose me anymore. I just needed them to hear me, whether they wanted to or not. The morning of the talk, I woke up in a hotel bed that somehow felt too big and too cold for the weight I was carrying on my chest, and as much as I tried to act like I had everything under control, like the eyeliner would hold, like the blazer I'd ironed twice would sit just right on my shoulders, there was this low throb of emptiness that had been building for days, maybe even years, that no amount of applause or public validation could smother. The TED staff were kind and efficient, and everything backstage moved like clockwork. The coffee was strong. The production crew smiled the kind of polite smiles you only learn in this kind of world. And all around me were speakers and thinkers and dreamers with their own stories to tell, people who had invented things, survived unthinkable tragedies, or turned grief into non-profit empires. And I stood among them not as a scientist or a founder or a viral sensation, but as a woman who had spent 2 decades learning how to speak truth without shaking, and somehow that felt more radical than anything else I'd ever done. My phone buzzed as I sat in the prep room waiting for my cue, and for the first time that day my heart jumped because a part of me, the child part, the wounded part, still hoped that maybe my parents had clicked the link I sent 2 days earlier. Or the follow-up text with a "just in case you wanna watch" message I'd sent that morning. But no, it was my friend Amanda, who had taken a red eye just to be in the audience, texting me a picture of the stage from her seat, telling me she was proud, telling me she had tissues ready in case I made her cry. And the contrast between her enthusiasm and my parents' indifference hit me like a cold wind through a cracked window. I opened Instagram to distract myself and saw a story from an old high school teacher I hadn't spoken to in years. She was watching from her laptop, tagging me, writing, "So proud of you, Ratch," in that bubbly handwriting she used to scribble on my short stories. And beneath it, a comment from someone I barely remembered from college: "You made it." And still, not a single word from my mother. Not a single acknowledgement from my father. Not even a thumbs-up emoji from Jenna, which, for her, would have been a full paragraph. 500 people tuned into the livestream that day. 500 pairs of eyes. 500 open minds and willing hearts, and yet the 2 people who claimed to have sacrificed everything for their daughters couldn't find the time or the interest to be among them. My stomach turned in on itself when I thought of my father in his workshop, probably sanding down the same piece of wood he'd been fussing over for weeks, pretending he didn't know exactly what day it was, pretending he wasn't avoiding it on purpose. And my mother, she'd likely been scrolling Facebook while half watching a rerun of some cooking show, telling herself she'd watch the recording later, knowing damn well she wouldn't, because she never had before and there was no reason to start now. When I finally walked onto that stage, I didn't think of the crowd, or the cameras, or the fact that this talk would be uploaded to YouTube and dissected by strangers. I thought of how loud the silence from my family felt, how heavy the absence was. I thought of every school play they skipped, every award they brushed off, every time they told me I should think about becoming a nurse, just to have something stable to fall back on, as though stability mattered more than joy, as though safety was the only currency worth earning. And maybe, somewhere deep in the background of my mind, I hoped that by the time I stepped off that stage, I'd see their names in my missed calls. Maybe they'd surprise me for once. Maybe they'd prove me wrong. But no. When I exited to the hallway, sweaty and electrified from the applause and the adrenaline still thrumming in my blood, I opened my phone and was met with a flood of notifications, friends live tweeting quotes from my speech, colleagues congratulating me. Even a former boss who once told me I was too intense, emailing me to say he was moved, but nothing from the people who shared my last name. It wasn't just the absence that hurt. It was the routine of it. The predictability. The way it had become normal to be invisible to them. That night, at the small reception organized for the speakers, I smiled and clinked glasses and tried to stay present, but every few minutes I'd glance at my phone again, like a fool, like someone who still believed in miracles. Jenna hadn't even liked the live stream post, which I knew she saw because she'd been active all day, commenting on photos of her dog, reacting to a cousin's engagement story. At some point, I sat alone at the bar, staring at the ice melting in my whiskey, wondering how I had managed to surround myself with supporters, with people who had grown into chosen family, and still feel this hollow ache in my chest that no kind word could quite reach. I scrolled through the comments again, and then I saw it, a message from someone I didn't recognize at first. It was a woman who had attended a writing workshop I taught 2 years ago. Her message was simple. Thank you for your story. I didn't know how much I needed to hear it today. And in that moment, I felt something shift. It wasn't closure, and it wasn't peace, but it was a reminder that what I had done mattered, that my voice had reached someone, even if it hadn't reached the people I once thought it had to. Later, in the hotel room, lying in bed with my makeup still on and my blazer folded neatly on the chair like some silent monument to restraint, I opened the group text with my family, the one where Jenna sent puppy updates and my mom sent coupon codes, and I typed a message that I hovered over for a long time before deleting. I wanted to say something sharp. I wanted to ask why they hadn't watched, why they didn't think it was important, why they didn't care. But I knew what the answer would be. They'd deny it, minimize it, say I was being dramatic again, just like always. So I said nothing. Because sometimes silence is louder than any speech. And that night, theirs was deafening. The TED Talk was supposed to be a milestone, a personal summit of sorts, not because of the red dot on the stage or the cameras broadcasting my words into living rooms and office screens across the country, but because it represented a moment I had carved out of decades of quiet irrelevance, years in which I had been dismissed as oversensitive, overly dramatic, too much, or simply not enough, depending on who was doing the judging and what version of me they were reacting to. I had spent the previous 2 months immersed in the structure and cadence of every word I would speak, going over the speech line by line, tweaking metaphors and pacing, trimming excess, but keeping the fire. Every sentence had been built with care, and not one word had been chosen accidentally. At least, that was the plan until the night before I took the stage, when something inside me, something raw and instinctive and a little bit angry, decided that I was done softening my edges for the sake of people who had spent most of my life acting like my edges didn't exist at all. Originally, I had planned to end with a neat, safe closing, a thank you to those who believed in me, a note of encouragement to anyone who felt voiceless, a general uplift that would sit nicely among other popular TED Talks and maybe even get clipped into some feel-good montage on YouTube. But as I rehearsed those words in my hotel room that night, standing in front of the full-length mirror with my hair pinned back and my hands clenching and unclenching around the clicker, I heard the falseness in them. Not because they weren't true in a general sense, but because they weren't my truth, not the unfiltered, guttural, don't-look-away truth that had driven me to this point in the first place. I had spent too long giving polite nods to people who had never clapped for me, too long thanking ghosts for holding doors they had, in fact, slammed in my face. And so, at 2 in the morning, with the hum of the city outside my window and the glow of my laptop screen making my eyes ache, I deleted the last paragraph of my talk and typed out something simpler, sharper, and infinitely more personal. And to those who said I'd never make it, stay exactly where you are. I made it without you. I stared at it for what felt like an hour, the words pulsing on the screen like a dare, and then I closed the file, turned off the light, and lay in bed knowing I had just thrown a stone that would ripple in ways I couldn't yet predict. When I spoke those words on stage, the audience didn't gasp or murmur or shift uncomfortably the way I had secretly feared they might. They cheered. Not just polite clapping cheered. There was a wave of sudden applause, loud and spontaneous, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I might cry right there under the spotlight, not because of the response, but because I realized just how long I had been waiting to say those words out loud. That line wasn't a punch, it was a release. It wasn't about revenge in the way people usually imagine revenge, where you get to rub someone's nose in your success. It was about letting go of the weight of waiting for recognition that was never going to come. It was about finally understanding that some people will never see you, no matter how brightly you burn. Backstage, I was met with handshakes and hugs, even a few tearful thank yous from strangers who felt like I had spoken for them. One woman, maybe in her 50s, grabbed both my hands and told me she hadn't spoken to her mother in 10 years, and that my story made her feel seen for the first time in a long time. Another man told me he'd spent most of his life trying to win his father's approval until one day he realized his father didn't want to be proud of him. He wanted to be right about his son being a failure. It hit me then, as I stood among those people and their buried wounds and fragile smiles, that I wasn't alone. My story wasn't unique in its pain, it was just finally named. And naming it had set something loose in other people, something they had kept quietly chained inside themselves for too long. But, of course, the silence I had been expecting, the one I had built that final line for, didn't last long. By the time I was in a cab back to the hotel, my phone lit up with a message from Jenna. No greeting, no congratulations, just a clipped sentence that read, "Was that about Mom and Dad?" I stared at the screen for a moment, debating how to answer, and then I typed back, "Why would you think that?" It was a small cruelty, I admit, a deliberate act of provocation. But I needed her to say it. I needed her to acknowledge that she knew. Because even though she had spent years defending them, covering for them, translating their silence into something she could live with, deep down she had seen what I had seen, that love in our house was transactional, conditional, and strategically distributed. She replied almost instantly, "They're devastated. Mom's crying. Dad's furious. You embarrass them in front of everyone." I let the words sit there for a few moments before responding, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, I wrote, "Did they even watch?" She didn't answer. And I didn't press. Because I already knew the answer. They hadn't watched live, of course they hadn't, but now that I had said something that pierced their carefully constructed image of themselves as supportive, loving parents, now they were paying attention. Now they were offended. Not by what I said, but by the fact that I said it where others could hear. There was a bitter irony in that, one I couldn't quite swallow. For years, I had begged for them to listen, to see me, to take interest in something I had created, and they had ignored it all. But the moment I told the truth, the moment I said something that made them uncomfortable, they suddenly became deeply invested. That night, I lay in bed replaying Jenna's message over and over again in my mind, wondering if she was crying because she knew I was right, or because she feared what I might say next. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of their disapproval. I wasn't chasing their praise. I wasn't trying to fix what had never been whole. I had said what needed to be said, not for them, not even for Jenna, but for the girl I used to be, the one who wrote poems in the dark, who whispered speeches to the mirror, who waited by the phone for a call that never came. I spoke for her. And that was enough. It was almost laughable, the way the conversation unfolded, not because it was funny, nothing about it was funny, but because the entire thing felt so eerily familiar, like walking back into a room you swore you'd never return to, only to find that nothing had changed. Not the way the light hit the walls, not the way the air stuck in your lungs, and certainly not the way your voice shook when you said something you knew would never land the way it needed to. When Jenna finally called, after a dozen passive-aggressive texts and one painfully vague message from our mother, something along the lines of, "We saw what you said, and it hurt more than you'll ever know," it wasn't out of curiosity or even concern, but out of that same old instinct we'd both been trained to perform since we were children: damage control, emotional triage, the invisible duty of the daughter who still wanted the house to look whole from the outside even if the beams inside were splintered and rotting from decades of silent tension. Her voice, as always, was measured, steady, calm in that way that people admire, but that I've always known was less about serenity and more about suppression, a kind of practiced restraint that made her a star student and a nightmare to argue with. She opened with a sigh that sounded like it had been rehearsed. "I just want to understand why you did it like that," she said, and I could already feel my body tensing, because I knew, with painful certainty, that like that didn't mean public or recorded or sharp, it meant honest. She wasn't upset that I had spoken. She was upset that I hadn't asked for permission to do it in a way that wouldn't upset the fragile fiction we'd all been pretending was truth for so long. I told her, slowly, deliberately, because I wanted her to really hear it, that I hadn't written the final line of my talk with the intention of hurting anyone, that I hadn't planned to make it personal or targeted or dramatic. But that when I stood on that stage and looked out at a sea of strangers who had chosen to listen to me, it felt like an insult to all of them to end my story with a lie. I couldn't thank people who hadn't supported me, who hadn't shown up, who had made it their silent mission to mold me into someone safer, smaller, quieter, someone more like her. And instead of answering, instead of acknowledging even an inch of what I'd just shared, Jenna said something that made the temperature in the room drop, something that came out so quietly I almost missed it. "Do you really think they never loved you?" I sat there, the phone pressed against my cheek, stunned by the simplicity of the question and the enormity of what it carried, because that was the crux of it, wasn't it? That was the great divide between us. That she had always interpreted their rules and limitations as care, while I had felt every restriction, every passive comment, every moment of absence as rejection. I told her, with a steadiness I hadn't felt before, that love isn't just about saying the word or putting dinner on the table or writing checks for college. It's about showing up, about bearing witness to the people your children are becoming, even when that version doesn't fit the mold you had in mind. And then, like a dam cracking, Jenna said something I never expected to hear. "I was always jealous of you, you know." The silence that followed her admission was so thick I could almost hear the static between our breathing, and, for a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But she went on, slowly at first, like someone peeling off a bandage they'd been told never to touch. She told me she hated being the perfect one, the reliable one, the daughter who got approval but never affection, who checked every box but never felt seen, and how, even in all her success, she felt like she was just playing a role she couldn't remember auditioning for. And then she told me something I will never forget, something that changed the shape of everything that came before and after. She told me that when I was 17, I got into a university I'd dreamed about since I was 15. A creative writing program that could have changed everything, but I never received the acceptance letter because our father intercepted it and decided, without telling anyone, that it would be better if I didn't know. At first, I thought she was lying or misremembering, or maybe even exaggerating something she'd half overheard, but she told me she'd found the letter, the actual letter, buried in a box in our father's office 2 years ago when she was helping them clear out some old paperwork. It had my name on it, and it was unopened, still sealed, tucked between tax files and a user manual for a drill. And when she asked him about it, he told her, flatly, that I wasn't ready, that I wouldn't have handled the rejection well, and that he didn't want to encourage delusions. She said she hadn't known what to do with that information, so she did what we'd both been taught to do, nothing. I sat there, phone still in hand, my vision narrowing into a tunnel of heat and pressure, as if the weight of everything I had spent my entire life trying to build was suddenly tipping sideways. I couldn't remember the last time I had cried from anger, real anger, the kind that lives in your bones and makes your teeth hurt. I had spent 20 years believing that I hadn't been accepted, that I hadn't been good enough, that maybe my dream had been too big or too ridiculous or too soft for the real world. And all along, it had been buried in a box, hidden by a man who called himself my protector. Jenna apologized, over and over, not just for keeping the secret, but for being complicit in a system that rewarded her for staying quiet while punishing me for speaking up. She said she didn't know how to fix it, and for once, I didn't try to comfort her. I let her cry. I let her sit in the discomfort. Because maybe for the first time, she was starting to understand what it meant to feel invisible, not just overlooked, but erased. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the moments that could have unfolded differently, all the versions of myself that were never given the chance to exist. And I wondered what it meant to be the product of a family that had only ever given love conditionally. I thought about whether I could forgive them, whether forgiveness was even the goal anymore, or if the real victory was finally knowing the truth, even if it arrived 20 years too late. And as the sky began to lighten outside my window, I felt something shift, not a clean break, but a slow unraveling of something tight and old and poisonous. Because maybe the revenge I had always imagined, the moment where they would finally admit they were wrong and I was right, wasn't as satisfying as this, the quiet power of no longer needing them to. By the time I agreed to the video call, the storm had already passed through the family group chat like a slow-moving wildfire. No immediate explosion, no theatrics, just the scorched remains of what used to be comfortable silence, replaced by a new, seething kind of discomfort that neither of my parents knew how to sit with, and so they did what they'd always done. They tried to act like everything was fine, like nothing had changed, as if I hadn't stood on a nationally broadcast stage and finally named, in front of an audience of strangers and watchers and distant acquaintances, the very thing we had all pretended didn't exist for most of my life. My mother scheduled the call like she was setting up a dentist appointment, casual, routine, as if this were just another check-in, a moment to clear the air with a few polite phrases and a lot of deflection, and my father, predictably, didn't say a word in advance, didn't send a message or a warning or even an acknowledgement, as if staying silent might help him stay clean in all this, like if he didn't speak it, then he didn't have to own it. When their faces finally flickered onto the screen, my mother sitting upright with a forced half-smile, my father behind her in the living room, arms crossed and eyes narrowed like he was watching a news segment he didn't agree with, I felt something inside me settle. Not because I was calm, not because I wasn't still angry, but because I had never been clearer in my life about what I was no longer willing to tolerate. I wasn't there to soothe them or to offer a softened version of events they could live with. I was there to say, without flinching, that they didn't get to claim me now that I had made something of myself, now that the world had decided my story was worth listening to. Not when they had dismissed that very same story for most of my childhood and early adult life as dramatic or ungrateful or simply untrue. My mother was the first to speak, and it was almost impressive how quickly she slid into the script she had probably been rehearsing for days, how she opened with, "We're really proud of you," before even addressing the talk itself, how she used vague, sweeping terms like "the way things came across" and the tone you used to try and tiptoe around the reality of what I'd actually said. It was only when I didn't respond, when I just stared at her with the same measured expression I'd learned from watching her do this dance for decades, that her mask cracked just a little and she finally said, "You made us look bad, Rachel. You aired private things in public. That wasn't fair." And that's when I realized starkly, suddenly, that they hadn't been hurt by the truth itself. They had been hurt by the exposure. They were fine with everything I'd endured, with every ignored milestone, every unacknowledged success, every birthday card without a signature, and every phone call that ended just a little too soon. What they weren't fine with was the idea that other people might now see it, that strangers might realize that the family Christmas card was a lie, that beneath the carefully curated suburban image was a deep and unspoken fracture that had never fully healed. My father, predictably, jumped in next, not to defend himself or even to argue, but to deliver his favorite line, the one he always pulled out when things got uncomfortable. "We did our best." I let those 4 words hang in the air for a moment before I responded, not because they deserved the space, but because I needed to feel, in my bones, just how much they relied on that sentence to absolve themselves of everything. And then, quietly but firmly, I said, "Your best would have included showing up. Your best would have been watching the live stream. Your best would have been telling me the truth about that letter instead of stealing a future I didn't even know I had." My father didn't blink. My mother looked away. And for the first time, maybe ever, I didn't try to fill the silence that followed. I let it sit there between us, raw and real and unignorable. What I said next wasn't planned, but it had been building inside me for years, crystallizing over every conversation that ended in me apologizing for wanting too much, for feeling too deeply, for asking why I had to be the one to shrink in order to fit their version of family. I told them that I was going on a podcast next week, one of the bigger ones, and that I'd be telling the story in full. Names would be used. Details would be included. Not for revenge, not because I wanted to punish them, but because, after a lifetime of being edited and minimized and conveniently forgotten, I was done pretending. I was done sparing people who had never once spared me. My mother's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to wipe away. My father's expression didn't change. And again, I didn't flinch. They didn't fight me on it. They didn't beg. They didn't deny it. Maybe because they knew it would be pointless. Maybe because, deep down, they understood that this had been coming for a very long time. Jenna never joined the call. I didn't expect her to. I knew she was probably watching from a distance, hoping it would resolve itself without another wave of damage control. But I didn't need her to bear witness this time. I didn't need anyone to. Because for once, I wasn't telling the story for a reaction. I was telling it because it was mine. After we ended the call, I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time, the kind of quiet that feels sacred rather than lonely, the kind that wraps around you not like isolation, but like freedom. I made myself tea. I opened my laptop. I played the recording of my talk. I watched myself step onto that red circle, shoulders squared, voice steady, and I watched the moment when I delivered that final line, not just as a speaker, but as someone who had lived every inch of what I was saying, to those who said I'd never make it. Stay exactly where you are. I made it without you. And I played it again. Not because I needed to hear it, but because I needed to remember the clarity in my own voice, the fire in my own eyes, the absolute stillness in the room when truth, once buried, finally found the air it deserved. Because the revenge, as it turns out, was never really about them. It wasn't even about proving them wrong. It was about finally living a life where their approval held no power, their absence no weight, their silence no sting. And the real victory, the one I never saw coming, was that, in the end, I didn't have to burn anything down to be free. I just had to stop waiting for them to notice the flame. Let them stay exactly where they are. I'm done circling back.